My fiancée said she wanted time to decide if I was still the right long-term partner. I agreed calmly, liquidated shared investments, reinforced my retirement plan, and legally separated our accounts. She reached out later when time passed, but stability no longer included her. I just need some time to figure out if you're really the right person for me long-term. She said it like she was reading from a menu. Like the decision to dismantle 4 years of a shared life together was something she'd casually browsed, something she could return if it didn't fit. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask her to explain it, qualify it, or soften it. I just looked at her across our kitchen table, the same table we'd spent Sunday mornings at, the same table where I proposed 14 months ago, and I said, "Okay." She blinked. That wasn't what she expected. She'd braced herself for a fight. She'd expected tears, or rage, or begging, or some version of me collapsing into the seat and asking what I'd done wrong. She got none of that. She got, "Okay." And then I stood up, poured the rest of my coffee into the sink, set the mug down carefully, and said, "Then I'll start making some adjustments." She asked what I meant by adjustments. I told her she'd see. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. I'm 34 years old. I've been with Vanessa for 4 years, engaged for just over 1. We don't have kids. We share an apartment in a mid-sized city where I work in financial planning and she works in brand consulting. That context matters, because it explains exactly why I knew what to do the moment she handed me that sentence. When you work in financial planning, you learn one thing faster than anything else. You learn that uncertainty is not a reason to wait. Uncertainty is a reason to act. Every client I've ever sat across from who lost their retirement, who found themselves underwater after a divorce, who suddenly realized their assets were tied to someone who no longer had aligned interests, every single one of them said the same thing. I thought there was still time. I thought we'd figure it out. I didn't want to seem like I was giving up. I had heard that speech so many times it had practically become a refrain in my sleep. So when Vanessa told me she needed time to decide if I was the right long-term partner, I heard something she didn't intend to say. I heard, our interests are no longer aligned. And when interests are no longer aligned, you don't wait. You restructure. The morning after that conversation, I woke up before she did. She'd slept in the bedroom. I'd taken the couch without being asked, not out of punishment, not out of drama, but because I needed to think clearly, and sharing space with someone who'd just told you they weren't sure about you tends to muddy thinking. I made coffee. I opened my laptop, and I started going through every financial thread that connected us. Joint savings account. Opened 2 years ago when we'd started talking seriously about buying a house. A shared investment portfolio, not huge, but significant, contributions from both of us over 18 months. Her name listed as beneficiary on 2 of my accounts. My name on her emergency contact and secondary card holder on one of her credit lines. A pre-purchase agreement we'd signed with a real estate broker, contingent on financing, to look at a property the following spring. None of it was legally binding in the way a marriage would have been. We weren't married yet. That was the one thing working clearly in my favor. And I moved methodically through each item, not in anger, not in panic, just the way you'd restructure any portfolio when the underlying asset changes its projected trajectory. By the time she came out of the bedroom at 8:30, I had a list. She poured herself coffee and looked at me sitting at the table with my laptop open and my notebook beside it. She said, "Are you working?" I said, "Something like that." She sat down across from me, and for a second, she looked like she wanted to revisit the previous night's conversation. Maybe walk it back. Maybe reframe it. She said, "I didn't mean it harshly last night." I said, "I know." She said, "I just need to process some things." I said, "That's completely fair." She seemed unsettled by how calm I was. She said, "You're not even going to ask me what's going on." And I looked at her for a moment, steady and clear, and I said, "Vanessa, you told me you're not sure I'm the right long-term partner for you. That's your answer. I don't need the detailed version of what led you there. What I need is to make sure that while you're figuring that out, I'm not sitting still." She stared at me. She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I'm going to start protecting myself financially. The same way any reasonable person would if the person they were planning a future with said they weren't sure anymore." The color changed in her face. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something closer to surprise. Like she'd thrown a stone into what she thought was a shallow puddle and discovered it had no bottom. That same afternoon, I called my financial advisor. His name is Derek, and he's been managing my personal account since I was 28. He knows me. He knows how I think. When I told him what had happened, he was quiet for a second, and then he said, "What do you want to do?" I told him I wanted to liquidate the shared investment portfolio. I told him I wanted to redirect my contributions into a solo account, one that only I had access to, and I wanted it structured around my retirement timeline, not a joint home purchase. He said, "Are you sure you want to do this now? Things could still change." I said, "If things change, we can rebuild. But I'm not going to sit in a position of shared exposure with someone who just told me our future is uncertain." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Okay, I'll get started." The shared investment portfolio required both signatures to dissolve. That was the complication. I went to Vanessa that evening and I explained it directly. No preamble, no emotional framing. I said, "The joint portfolio requires both of our authorizations to close. I'd like to initiate the dissolution process. Your half will be transferred directly to you, my half to me, and the account will close cleanly." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "You're really doing this?" I said, "You told me you needed time to decide if I was the right long-term partner. I'm not going to keep shared financial infrastructure open during an uncertain period. That's not about emotion. That's just practical." She said, "This feels really permanent." I said, "So did what you said last night." She didn't have an answer for that. She signed the authorization 2 days later. I think part of her assumed I'd softened before then, that I'd come to her with some version of, "I overreacted, let's talk, let's work this out." She underestimated something about me that had been true my entire adult life. I do not make reactive decisions, but once I've made a decision, I don't reverse it out of sentiment. The portfolio closed. Her share went to her account. My share went into a personal investment account that I restructured entirely around my retirement date. I hired Derek to manage it with an aggressive but protected strategy, one designed for solo growth, not couple-sized purchasing power. The pre-purchase real estate agreement was the next item. I contacted the broker and explained that we were withdrawing from the contingency arrangement. Since we hadn't placed any earnest money and hadn't passed the financing contingency stage, we were able to exit cleanly. The broker was professional about it, asked if we might revisit in the future. I said I wasn't in a position to speculate on that. He said he understood. The beneficiary update took about a week to fully process across the accounts where her name appeared. I designated my younger brother, Qley, instead. He didn't know about any of this yet. I hadn't told anyone in my personal life what was happening. There's a version of this story where I talk about how painful it was. And it was. Let me be honest about that. Because there's a difference between acting calmly and feeling nothing. I felt a great deal. Every time I moved through one of these steps, there was a moment, sometimes just a flash, sometimes longer, where I could see the version of my life that was supposed to happen instead. The house, the mortgage, the mornings at that same kitchen table, but with a different weight to them. A comfortable weight, the kind that comes from actually landing somewhere and knowing it's yours. I'd wanted that. I'd built toward that. I'd chosen her specifically because I believed, with a confidence I rarely feel about anything outside of a spreadsheet, that she was the right person to build it with. And now I was unbuilding it. Not in a way that destroyed anything. In a way that was precise and deliberate and protected both of us from a prolonged mess if the unthinkable became the actual. But I felt it. Every step. Vanessa and I were still living together during all of this. That was the strange part. We weren't fighting. We weren't icy or cruel or performatively distant. We were just careful with each other. Polite in the way that people are polite when they know something is fragile and don't want to be the one who breaks it. She'd ask how my day was. I'd tell her. I'd ask if she needed anything from the grocery store. She'd tell me. We'd share dinner sometimes, and sometimes we wouldn't. We were coexisting in the way people do when the architecture of a relationship has already changed but the walls are still technically standing. About 10 days in, she came to find me while I was reading in the living room. She sat down across from me and she said, "Can I ask how you're doing?" Like, actually. I put the book down. I said, "I'm fine." "What's going on with you?" She said, "I feel like you've already left. Like, emotionally you're already somewhere else." I said, "I'm right here." She said, "That's not what I mean." I said, "Vanessa, what you're describing is me not being in distress. You asked me for time to figure out if I'm the right long-term partner for you. I gave you that time. I'm not going to perform suffering while you do your thinking." She said, "It feels like you've already decided." I said, "I've decided to take care of myself, which is exactly what I should be doing." She was quiet. Then she said, very softly, "I don't want to lose you." I said, That's a strange thing to say to someone you're not sure about. I want to pause here and explain something about Vanessa, because this story is easy to flatten in a particular direction if I don't. She's not a villain. She's not someone who was secretly terrible this whole time, pulling the wool over my eyes. She's someone who got scared. I know that now with more clarity than I had then. But scared people make real decisions. And you can love someone, truly love them, and still have to protect yourself from the consequences of the decisions they make when they're afraid. She and I had been through a hard stretch in a year before she said those words. Her business contract had ended suddenly. A major client pulled out of an agreement, and it had hit her hard. Not just financially, though that was part of it. It hit her identity, her sense of who she was in the world. She'd spent about 3 months in a kind of low-grade fog, not depressed exactly, but not herself either. And I'd been there. I'd supported her. I'd taken on more of the household costs without making her feel guilty about it. I'd given her room. I told her consistently that it was going to be okay. What I didn't know, what I found out later, piece by piece, in the conversations that followed the initial one, was that during those 3 months, she had started spending time with a friend group that didn't include me. And in that group was a guy named Felix. Felix was someone she'd known before me. Not an ex, not technically, but someone who had once been an option. Someone who was now single again. And during those 3 months of fog, Vanessa had started talking to Felix. First about work, then about more. Not physically. I believe her on that, and I'm not someone who extends belief charitably when the evidence doesn't support it. But emotionally, she'd been somewhere I hadn't been invited. She'd been telling Felix things she wasn't telling me. Processing things with him. Laughing with him in a way that had slowly started to feel more necessary than the way she laughed with me. The time to figure out if you're the right long-term partner sentence wasn't born in a vacuum. It was born in the space between her and Felix over 3 months of private conversations while I thought I was holding her steady. She told me this in fragments. The first fragment came about 2 weeks in, when I found a message on her phone. Not snooping, she'd left it open on the counter and a notification came through, and I saw his name. I didn't go through the thread. I didn't ask her to explain it. I just said, quietly, "Felix has been messaging you." Not a question. She turned around from the sink, and she said, "Yes." She didn't elaborate right away. She just let the word sit there. I said, "How long?" She said, "A few months." I said, "Since when you were going through the contract situation?" She said, "Around then, yes." I said, "And that's connected to where we are now." She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. I nodded once, and I went back to what I was doing. I didn't rage. I want to be clear about that. Not because I'm emotionally unavailable, not because I don't feel things with full force, but because rage in that moment would have been information I didn't want to give her. It would have told her that she still had that kind of power over my interior state. And she'd just spent 2 weeks watching me restructure my financial future without a tremor. I wasn't going to undo that by throwing something. What I did instead was call my friend Nate that evening from the parking garage of our building, just standing between 2 cars in the cold, and I said, she was emotionally checked out with someone else while I was helping her get through a hard time. Nate said, "Man." I said, "Yeah." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "What I'm already doing. Same thing, just with more clarity now." Nate said, "You doing okay?" I said, "Not really, but I'm functional." He said, "That's something." It was. The legal account separation had mostly completed by the end of week 3. My name was off her secondary credit line. Her name was off my accounts. The beneficiary designations were updated. The real estate contingency was dissolved. The investment portfolio was split and closed. What remained was the apartment lease. We were both on it. 11 months left on a 12-month term. I spoke with the building management office and asked about buyout options. They offered a standard lease termination clause, 2 months rent penalty, split between vacating parties if both agreed. I told them I'd follow up. Then I went back to Vanessa, and I had one of the most practical conversations I've ever had in my life. I sat down across from her, and I said, "We need to talk about the apartment." She said, "I know." I said, "There are a few options. You stay, I go. I stay, you go. Or we both terminate the lease early with the penalty. I'd recommend you take the apartment if you'd like it, because I can find something with more flexibility, and I'd rather not be somewhere with a full year's worth of memories in every corner anyway. But that's your call." She stared at me for a long time. She said, "You've really thought all of this through." I said, "I'm a financial planner. This is what I do." She said, "You're not going to fight for this at all, are you?" I said, I'm not going to fight to stay in a situation where someone isn't sure about me. I have too much respect for myself and, honestly, for you. She said softly, what if I'm sure now? I said, 3 weeks ago you weren't. What changed? She said, watching you do all of this. It made me realize what I was risking. I looked at her. Steady. I said, Vanessa, I don't want to be the person you choose because watching me leave scared you. That's not love. That's fear management. And I've spent my entire career helping people not make financial decisions based on fear. I'm not going to make a life decision based on someone else's. She had tears in her eyes. I could feel the pull of them. I'm not made of stone. But I'd learned something in the last 3 weeks. The version of me that would have folded in that moment, that would have said, okay, let's just forget all of this and go back. That version of me didn't have very good odds of a stable future. So I said, I'm going to give you the apartment. I'll move out by the end of the month. You let me know if you want to cover the whole lease or if you want to split the termination fee with me. Either way, I'll make it work. I moved into a furnished short-term rental for the first 2 months. It was smaller than I was used to. It had a narrow window that looked out onto the side of another building and a kitchen that could charitably be described as compact. It was fine. I cooked simple things. I slept well, which surprised me. I exercised more than I had in a year. I had a lot of quiet evenings that should have felt lonely, but mostly felt like decompression. Like a pressure I hadn't fully registered I was carrying had been set down somewhere. I saw Nate a few times. I told him the whole story over beer one evening, start to finish, and he listened without interrupting, which is something I've always respected about him. When I was done, he said, so what happens now? I said, now I find a place I actually want to live. I keep building the retirement account. I stopped dividing my financial planning between what's good for me and what's good for a future I was imagining. And I move forward. He said, and Vanessa? I said, she has her answer. She just didn't like it. I found an apartment in the spring. 11th floor. City view. 2 bedrooms, which made no logical sense for a single person except that I'd spent 4 years in a space that always had to account for someone else's preferences, and I wanted a room that was just mine. I set it up as a home office. I bought the furniture I wanted without compromise. I installed the bookshelf I'd always wanted, but that Vanessa had thought was too industrial for the aesthetic she preferred. I put a record player in the living room because I'd always wanted one and had talked myself out of it because she said vinyl was pretentious. I'm not sure vinyl is pretentious. I think it just requires a kind of patience that not everyone has. I have it. I found that out in the spring. I restructured my retirement contributions in April. Derek and I sat down and went through everything from scratch. No more planning around a joint mortgage. No more conservative positioning that had been calibrated around the idea that 2 incomes would cover the real estate. Solo strategy. Aggressive early positions. A timeline that made sense for one person who intended to retire at 62 and live the second half of his life entirely on his own terms. It felt clarifying in a way I hadn't expected. There's something strange about financial planning for just yourself after years of factoring in another person. It's both freer and more pressurized. Freer because you answer to no one. More pressurized because you are the only safety net. But I was good at this. This was literally my profession. And I'd been softening my own approach for 4 years because I was planning around a partnership. Now I had room to build the way I'd always known how to build. About 5 months after I moved out, I got a text from Vanessa. It was a Tuesday evening. I was making dinner. The text said, hey, I know it's been a while. I've been doing a lot of thinking. Would you be open to talking sometime? I read it twice. I set my phone face down on the counter. I finished making dinner. I ate. I washed the dishes. I sat in my living room with the record player going, and I thought about it properly before I responded. I wasn't cruel in my response. Cruelty wasn't something I had energy for. I said, hey, I'm glad you're doing okay. I'm open to talking, but I want to be clear about where I'm at before we do. I've made a lot of changes over the last few months, and I'm in a genuinely good place. If talking means exploring whether there's still a future together, I want you to know that's not something I'm open to. But if you need closure or just want to talk as people who shared for years, I can do that. She responded quickly. She said, I think I need both. But I hear you. I said, okay. We met for coffee about a week later. Not at any place we used to go. Neutral ground. A coffee shop near my office that she'd never been to. I got there first. I sat with my espresso and watched the door. When she walked in, I noticed she looked tired. Not bad. Not unhealthy, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from the inside. She sat down across from me. She ordered. We did a few minutes of the easy stuff. How's work? How's the apartment? are you still at the same firm? Then she said, I ended things with Felix. I said, I didn't ask about Felix. She said, I know. I wanted to tell you. I said, okay. She said, it wasn't what I thought it was. It was just, he was there during a time when I felt like I was disappearing. And you were so solid. You were always so solid. And I think I mistook that for you not needing me. I looked at her. I said, I didn't need you. I chose you. For years, an engagement, a plan for a house. That was all real. She said, I know. I said, but you needing to decide if I was still the right long-term partner for you. That decision didn't come from nowhere. You'd already been somewhere else emotionally. I didn't know that at the time. I just knew you were unsure. And I responded to what was in front of me. She said, you responded by dismantling everything. I said, I responded by protecting myself. There's a difference. She said, is there? Because from where I was standing, it felt like punishment. I thought about that. I said, I understand why it felt that way. But it wasn't. Punishment would have been making noise about it. I made no noise. I just restructured. The way you'd restructure any plan when the foundational assumption changes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, do you still love me? It was a brave question. The kind of question that takes more courage to ask than most people realize, because the answer might be the one thing you can't recover from. I said, I did love you. Genuinely. And some version of that doesn't just disappear. But I'm not in love with you the way I was. And I think, if I'm being fair to both of us, I'm not sure I could get back there. Not because of anger, but because that conversation in the kitchen, the way you said it, the fact that you'd already been emotionally somewhere else for months, something shifted in me that I can't unshift. She nodded. Her eyes were glassy. She said, I think I needed to hear that. I said, I think you did too. She asked, toward the end of the coffee, if I was seeing anyone. I said no. She said, you seem really at peace. I said, I am. She said, I'm not. I thought the time apart would make things clearer. It just made me miss what we had. I said, what you missed is the version of things before you decided you were unsure. But that version didn't include the truth about where you'd been for 3 months. So you'd be missing something that wasn't completely real. She said, that's a really brutal thing to say. I said, maybe, but you're a smart woman. I think you know it's accurate. She didn't argue. We finished the coffee. She hugged me at the door, brief and tight, the kind of hug that means something and nothing at the same time. She said, take care of yourself. I said, I always do. She smiled at that, a small, sad smile. And then she turned and walked off down the street. I stood at the door of that coffee shop for another minute, not watching her go, just standing there, breathing, letting the moment exist as it was, complicated and complete and over. Here's what the next several months looked like, practically speaking. My retirement account had grown at a rate I hadn't projected under the previous conservative plan. Derek called me in late summer and said, whatever you did to clear your head after the breakup, keep doing it. Your decision-making has been exceptional. I laughed at that. It was the most accurate and least emotionally useful thing anyone had said to me in a year. I'd taken on 2 new clients at the firm, larger portfolios than I'd typically managed, and I'd done well by them. I'd traveled for the first time in 3 years without worrying about coordinating time off with someone else's calendar. I went to Portugal. I went to the Pacific Northwest. I drove through stretches of landscape that made me feel small in a way I found genuinely therapeutic. I started seeing someone, eventually. Her name was Petra. She was a structural engineer who had the most organized mind I'd ever encountered outside of a financial spreadsheet. She was direct. She was grounded. She didn't need to decide if I was the right long-term partner. She said, on our 3rd date, over a dinner that had stretched past 2 hours because we'd completely lost track of time, I haven't felt this comfortable talking to someone in years. I said, same. She said, I should warn you I'm not good at hiding when I'm interested in someone. I said, that's actually one of my top 3 requirements in another person. She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that didn't have anything complicated behind it. Just genuine, just present, just real. Vanessa texted again in the fall, about 9 months after the coffee. The text said, I've been thinking about us a lot lately. I know you said you weren't open to exploring things again, but I feel like I need to at least say, I made a mistake. Not just strategically, morally. You deserved better from me, and I didn't give it to you, and I've been living with that. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know. I read it carefully. I thought about it for a day before I responded. Then I wrote back, I appreciate you saying that. Genuinely. And I don't carry anger about it. What happened happened. I'm in a good place now, and I hope you are too. But I want to be honest with you. My life has moved in a direction that doesn't have room for what we were or for re-exploring it. Not because I'm punishing you, just because I built something new after, and I built it well, and I'm not going to dismantle that. I hope you find what you're looking for. She didn't respond for 3 days. When she did, she said, "You always were good at building things." I wrote back, "Yeah." And that was it. That was the last time we spoke. There's a conversation I had with my brother Cole about 6 months after I'd moved out. He'd known something was off. He's perceptive, always has been, but I hadn't told him the details until one evening when he visited and we sat up past midnight with takeout boxes between us, and I told him the whole thing. When I got to the part about the portfolio liquidation, the account separations, the lease buyout conversation, he was quiet. Then he said, "Most guys would have either done nothing or completely fallen apart." I said, "I know." He said, "Where did you learn to do that?" I said, "Work partly. But also, I think growing up watching Dad, honestly. Watching how he handled things when things went sideways. He never panicked. He always said, the first thing you do is get clear on what you actually have. Not what you thought you had. What you actually have." Cole nodded slowly. He said, "Vanessa didn't know what she had." I said, "Vanessa knew exactly what she had. She just didn't know what losing it would feel like." He said, "Is that a difference?" I said, "It's the whole thing." Something I've thought about a lot in the time since. The phrase she used, the right long-term partner. I've turned it over so many times it's practically smooth. There's a way of thinking about relationships that treats them like products. Like you're always comparison shopping. Like no matter who you're with, you've got a browser tab open somewhere with alternatives. And some people would argue that's just modern reality. That people have more options now. That the economics of connection have changed. Maybe. But I think there's a cost to carrying that mindset into a commitment. When you're engaged to someone and you still frame your evaluation of them as figuring out if they're the right long-term partner, you haven't actually committed. You're sitting 1 foot in the relationship and 1 foot in the hypothetical. And the person you're with, the one who's planning, building, investing, showing up, is the only one fully inside the door. That's an imbalance that doesn't resolve itself. It compounds. I was fully inside the door. She had 1 foot in and 1 foot pointed at Felix. And I didn't know that. I thought I was building a shared foundation. I was building one half of a foundation while she stood at the edge deciding if she wanted to walk on it. Here's what I know now, a year and a half removed from that kitchen table conversation. I know that my retirement account is on track to exceed every projection Derek and I had made under the joint plan. I know that the apartment on the 11th floor has become something I actually love coming home to. I know that the industrial bookshelf looks exactly right. I know that Petra is someone I describe, if someone asked me quietly and directly, as the person I didn't know I was building toward. She doesn't need me to perform stability. She is stable. She doesn't need reassurance that I'm in it. She's in it. And the difference between someone who needs to decide if you're the right long-term partner and someone who already knows, that difference is not subtle. It's not something you have to interpret. You feel it in how someone looks at you across a table. You feel it in whether the conversation at midnight goes somewhere real or runs in cautious circles. You feel it in whether you're both building toward the same point on the horizon or only one of you is walking. The last practical item I want to mention. About 14 months after the split, I was reviewing my accounts with Derek, going over the annual performance summary. He showed me the year-over-year growth since the restructure. He showed me the retirement projection, updated and current. He showed me where I'd been when I was planning around the joint home purchase versus where I was now. He said, "You know, the liquidation and restructure you did that first week, that was the right call. Not just emotionally. Financially, you made almost exactly the right moves in exactly the right order." I said, "I know." He said, "Most people in that situation freeze. Or they wait and hope. Or they let the uncertainty drag on, and it costs them." I said, "I've seen what that costs. I wasn't going to let it happen to me." He said, "The solo retirement model you're running now is actually better suited to your earning pattern and investment timeline than the joint model was. The joint model was optimized for a house purchase in the next 3 years. This model is optimized for you." I let that sit for a moment. Optimized for me. Not for a future I'd imagined. Not for a plan built around someone else's presence. For me, what I actually had. Not what I thought I had. Cole called me the week I got that summary from Derek. He asked how things were going. I told him about the numbers. He said, "Dad would be pleased." I said, "Yeah." He said, "What about Petra?" I said, she's good. Really good. He said, you sound different. I said, what do you mean? He said, lighter. Like something that was wound up is just not anymore. I thought about that. I said, I think I spent a long time trying to make a plan work that had a fundamental structural problem I didn't let myself see. And when I finally got clear on what I actually had, not what I thought I had, everything else followed naturally. Cole was quiet for a second. Then he said, that sounds like something Dad would say. I said, yeah, it does. Vanessa got a new job in the fall, about a year after we split. I know this because we have a small number of mutual connections through work, brand consulting, and financial planning overlap occasionally, and someone mentioned it in passing. I was glad for her. That's the truth. Not performatively, not as a way of showing I was over it. Genuinely glad. I had genuinely loved her. And the person you genuinely love, even when the relationship is over, even when the way it ended was painful, you don't wish misery on. You wish them a life that suits them. You hope they land somewhere that asks the right things of them. You hope they don't make the same mistake twice. I don't know if she learned what I think she needed to learn. I'm not in a position to know. That chapter is complete. If I had to reduce everything that happened, the conversation at the kitchen table, the weeks of methodical restructuring, the split, the quiet rebuilding, the new apartment, and the record player and Petra and the retirement account performing better than it ever had. If I had to reduce all of it to one thing, I would tell someone who found themselves in that same kitchen, looking at the same face, saying the same words. Don't wait for the other person to decide. Make your own decision. Not out of spite. Not as a performance to make them regret it. But because you are a person with a future, and that future keeps moving whether or not the person across from you has figured out what they want. You cannot put your life in a holding pattern because someone else is uncertain. Uncertainty is not a reason to wait. It is a reason to act. Get clear on what you actually have. Build from there. And do not for sentiment, not for fear, not for the memory of what used to be good. Do not rebuild what you've carefully taken apart just because someone realized too late that they didn't want to lose it. What they didn't want to lose is the version of things where they still had all the options. That's not the same as wanting you. Knowing the difference is everything. The kitchen table is in Vanessa's apartment now. I bought a different one. Narrower. Better for one-person Sunday mornings. The record player is in the living room. Petra thinks vinyl is thoughtful. Not pretentious. Thoughtful. She said it the first time she came over and I put a record on, and she listened to the first few seconds of it and said, there's something different about listening to something that has to be physically flipped. It makes you commit to the experience. I said, yeah. She said, I like that. And I thought, I do too. I am not the person I was sitting at that table. Not worse. Not harder. Not hollowed out. Just clearer. Just better calibrated to what I actually want and what I'm actually worth. Just no longer building plans around assumptions I haven't stress tested. Just optimized, finally for me. And that has made all the difference.